I know some of you from serving in Deb's role for 3 years and being the brilliant person to hire Jacob. Yes, that was me. So you're all welcome. And worked so closely with Clint, who's a volunteer extraordinaire, and miss you all very much. So I was really excited to have the opportunity to speak with you all. I am now the executive director of Charles River Watershed Association. So so we're working very closely on this project. And Jacob, maybe you could just go to the next slide. I just have one slide on us. And so for folks who grew up in this area and are old like me, you remember when the Charles River was a disgusting dump, and it's a lot cleaner now. And there are many people who can claim credit for that success, but CRWA is definitely central among those. So protecting and preserving the Charles is still our mission. Now, what this project is about is, well, I have a little slide that goes, so I'll start with the area. So you can just see, and we can zip through these slides pretty quickly. So you can see the area that we will be talking about, which is the Allston exit of the Mass Pike near the Charles River. Next slide. And usually I have my little pointer here, but that sort of curly queue of exits is the Allston and Cambridge exits. And that area right in the middle, that sort of half circle or whatever, half almond, is the area that is just old rail yards now and is going to be able to be redeveloped. It's owned by Harvard and turned into a new neighborhood once those curly queue of roads are gone. Next slide.
They're going to be straightened out.
All right, we'll get to that.
I didn't realize how much of a spaghetti bowl that looks from the air.
So Clint, this is you.
So hi, I'm Clint Richmond. I'm co-chair of the Transportation Committee here at the Sierra Club, and with John Kuiper, who's also on the phone today and has worked on this issue as well. So John, feel free to chime in as well. Some of you may know I like history, so I just wanted to throw in one historical slide to show what this all looked like before the Pike. So this is 1938, which would be kind of the peak era of the railroad. And this is before Storrow Drive was built. So I don't know how many of these you've seen, Emily. So you'll see at the top of the image is Storrow Memorial Embankment, which sort of became Storrow Drive, and then they extended the river out further. I guess you could say it was an incursion back then. But and then you have Commonwealth Avenue in the beginning and in the middle, and then at the bottom you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4 tracks of rail, and that's where the Pike is today. So they kind of moved. They only kept two tracks of rail, and then moved it down, and then sort of put the Pike in there. So this is sort of actually at Audubon Circle. Well, St. Mary's is Audubon Circle there. You can see on the left. But there's BU in the middle. Sort of, you can see there's that gray orangey sort of blob. It actually says College of Business Administration of Boston University. So this is the throat, and you can see it's pretty narrow. But we'll get to that, and when we get to the next slide.
So this shows what's coming. There's going to be, like I said, a new neighborhood, and those yellow lines show where the new street grid will be. And that orange kind of in the middle is where the new West Station will be built, assuming this all gets done. Anything more you want to say about this Clint?
Yeah, the point I'd like to make about this slide, and I'm glad you had this one, is that Soldiers Field Road is the extension of Storrow Drive, which was, sort of put in the 50s. Really over, just ironically, the Storrow family was against this, but they decided to name that after them. They waited until first Mr. Storrow died, then Mrs. Storrow Drive, then they built Storrow Drive when she couldn't fight it anymore. Anyway, so Storrow Drive was actually originally like a riding track. You're supposed to take your horses out there and they could kind of go crazy. So it was meant to be more recreational, and there are no exits there between the BU Bridge on the right and the River Street at the top of the screen or the top of the image. So those two new roads that are being put in that don't exist today Cambridge Street South, and I think it's called Hotel Way or something. I'm looking at the image.
Yeah, that's
Um,
what it is.
they're turning those into exits. So the thing is still very auto-centric in my view, that they're taking Storrow Drive and making it more like a highway and adding more exits to it. So they're increasing the importance of it and, you know, making it really that much harder to get to the river. So, I mean, on my more radical days, I would sort of actually just rip up Soldiers Field Road from say the hotel down to BU Bridge, and then you could have access to the river. But again, no one's thinking like that at the moment. But so next slide, I guess.
So this shows how it looks today. And you can see the throat area. You can see pretty clearly how much roadway is squeezed into this area right now. And this is the area that's most challenging in this whole project.
And the important thing to note about this is that the Mass Pike is the elevated section there. And then if you look at the top of the image, it's hard to see, but that's where that pretzel interchange is, which actually was the first portion of the pike that was built coming from the west. And then they built this, and they opened that up, and then they built further, and then it was opened up in stages. The rail, you might not be able to see it too well, in the lower right, it sort of starts at the BU Bridge and goes under the viaduct, is the Grand Junction Railway, which is a freight only line today and has been proposed as a passenger connection from, you know, from the west, from Worcester, from Newton to Kendall Square and North Station.
Next slide.
Yeah. Oh, this is me. So this is looking at it as a side view here of the throat. And here's all the things that they would have to squeeze in if they put it at grade level. So you see the two tracks, the two measly tracks of the Worcester line are on the far right. Then there are two tracks for the Grand Junction Railroad, and those lines don't really cross, and I don't think are meant to cross ever, except maybe to move equipment. And then you've got the 8 lanes of the Pike, and notice there's no shoulder there, basically. And then you have 4 lanes of Soldiers Field Road, and then the dotted line is the land today. So the Paul Dudley White Path, as it's called today, is that portion. It's still in the river. So they just sort of ran out of room, and this is where, you know, some advocates have started to question, you know, why is so much being jammed in there, and what's the distribution between the different modes, right? We're trying to triple track the Worcester line, far cry from its quadruple track of the past, but that triple tracking would end with inside Boston, even though you might argue you need it there the most. So no one's talking about adding 3 tracks of the Worcester line, and the Paul Dudley White section, if you can see it there, is actually only 12 feet wide. So that's a mixed use path, and that's really kind of below the minimum requirements for, you know, for groups like national standards groups like AASHTO for those kinds of modes, right? You're supposed to have 8 feet for bicycle and 6 feet for pedestrians. Well, that would be 14 feet just at the absolute minimum, but there's only 12 there. So they've really not, you know, deprioritized the active transportation within the various, you know, modal distribution of this admittedly very narrow section.
Next slide. So it occurred to me this slide should have probably come before Clint's just now. I was confessing to the folks earlier that we did not spend tons of time preparing, a little bit last minute, but hopefully this will still make sense. So just to give people a timeline of what is going on here. So the viaduct, which just means sort of the overpass or the elevated part of the highway in Allston, the elevated part of the Mass Pike, needs to be repaired. And you just drive on Soldiers Field Road heading west, and you can see that it looks like it's crumbling. So it's being repaired every year. It's expensive. It needs to be replaced. To their credit, several years ago, MassDOT suggested, I think with prodding from others, let's rebuild this right. Let's just not rebuild it as is. Let's really be forward thinking and do it in a multimodal way, and really invest in ways to promote walking and cycling and transit. And so a task force was created in 2014. Charles River Watershed Association is a stakeholder in that task force. It was identified early on that the throat area is the most challenging part of the project. So speeding ahead, last January, the MassDOT Secretary, Stephanie Pollock, chose what was called sort of the hybrid design, where Soldier Field Road is elevated, the Mass Pike was below that. There was plenty of space created for extra parkland and cycling and pedestrians. Wasn't all squeezed in the way you just saw. And so CRWA was happy, a lot of the advocates were happy. And then it turned out several months later, we learned that in order to build it that way, it would require putting a temporary road into the Charles River, putting Soldiers Field Road into the river, like basically on a structure or bridge or whatever, for a temporary period of 8 to 10 years. And not only had we supported the project, but we had actually gave Stephanie Pollock an award at our annual meeting last year before we knew all of this. So then it was a little awkward to be like, wait, what? Wow, this sucks. So we weren't the only ones, because it also turned out that part of the construction would be reducing the number of lanes on the Mass Pike for many years, reducing service on the Worcester lane. And so a lot of folks were not happy. And so she pulled back from that project, and it's kind of been a mess since then. But she did announce that she would be coming up with a new design. And in the interim, the Mass Environment and Energy Secretary, Katie Theohardis, announced that it would not be acceptable to, or it'd be very hard to permit a project that would have a significant intrusion into the river. So that was CRWA's goal. So from our perspective, we've sort of won. But overall, we do support the wider goals, I think, that we all share, and certainly that Sierra Club shares, in terms of multimodal options and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the status now is she is evaluating 3 designs. Next slide, please.
I was gonna jump in before we go
sorry.
So the hybrid plan, was definitely a compromise, because ideally you don't want any elevated highway. So for people who live in Cambridge or Allston, it kind of disperses the noise more widely to have an elevated highway. So it has a negative impact, on people who are visiting the river, and it carries all the way across the river to Cambridge. And any kind of viaduct is, creates kind of a barrier for it's not really at the human scale. So people don't want to go under it, or it's hard to bridge over it. So that's why there's been a push most recently, as you'll see in the upcoming design, for the at grade solution. And when we found out how horrific the construction period would be, then we said, okay, the hybrid sounds, maybe we could swallow that. But then it was the construction process that really pushed everybody over the edge and say, what do you mean road in the river? What do you mean one track of commuter rail? What do you mean you're not going to build West Station? There's all this pushback on that. So that was it. That kind of came to a head at the February meeting of MassDOT, where, well, Emily and I were there together again.
Okay, Jacob. And just to be clear, all of these project designs do include many good things that many of us, if not all of us, want, which is that new neighborhood, West Station, the possibility of the Grand Junction, though some of us think that should be more explicit sooner, bicycle and pedestrian connections, and the bike path. Next slide.
Well, hold on.
Oh, well, okay. Well, let me just say one more thing. But this only happens if it gets built. So that's why, if Stephanie Pollock gets angry and is like, forget it, I'll just rebuild it as is, then no one wins. Go ahead.
Right. But the important thing is to note is that these are long-term goals that I think, that the MassDOT has bought into, but they haven't actually committed to future Grand Junction service. This would sort of preserve it, right, and set it up. And West Station, I think is still officially not anything until 2040 under the MassDOT plans. I mean, that's just insane to have, wait 20 years for that station. There's been talk of a temporary station and Harvard might help build it, or BU might throw in a very pittance. But there's been really a lack of commitment to those other modes. So a lot of groups like, CLF or Transit Matters and Livable Streets been saying this needs to be a transit first project to really make it a multimodal project. And soon, like immediately. I mean, Transit Matters says, let's build regional rail now. Let's electrify the Worcester line. I mean, it's like, do it now while there's all this construction and people are going to be, open to switching modes, because the Pike's going to be a mess, but you don't want to make the rail a mess at the same time.
Okay.
Next slide.
And I just raised this, folks may have seen there's been a couple op-eds by Robin Chase and Doug Foy in the Boston Globe, really focusing on something that hadn't been talked about as part of this in the whole 6 years since the task force has been in place, which is to really look at Soldiers Field Road and Storrow Drive. As Clint noted, the Storrow Drive was never supposed to exist. It was a park, and the people who donated the land, the Storrows, never wanted it, and they literally did wait until Mrs. Storrow died until creating a road. And even if you're gonna have a road, it's a parkway, and a parkway has a very specific definition in Massachusetts. It's supposed to be slower. It's supposed to offer access to the park. It's not supposed to be the mini highway that it has turned into. So this does, in theory, offer an opportunity to think bigger, as Doug and Robin have been advocating for, and actually reduce Soldiers Field Road and Storrow Drive to 2 lanes, add pedestrian crossings, traffic lights, and that would also create more space for more parks, cycling, and pedestrian access. Next slide. So, as I said, from CRWA's perspective, we're good. But if we think about the larger goals that we all share in terms of transportation emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, what we're talking about, what Clint and I have been talking about, and some of the advocates have been talking about, is to not only do the at-grade version, but to reduce the number of lanes. That might seem extreme, but then when you take into account the wider goals that have already been agreed to, so Boston already has set a goal. Now their document calls it an aspirational goal, but it's still in writing, of reducing the number of car trips in the city by half. Governor Baker agreed in his State of the Union last year of net zero emissions by 2050. The state Senate has voted, I think, more than once on more ambitious greenhouse gas emissions than are existing in state law. And then MassDOT's Green Dot initiative, which the Secretary, you don't really hear her talking about, has a lot of goals that would be consistent with reducing lanes. And then if you remember the Governor's Commission on Transportation had numerous recommendations that would be consistent with lane reduction here, prioritizing investment in transit and so forth, getting people out of vehicles, basically. So again, it looks like I'm a little out of order here. The green shows where the quote unquote temporary road would have been that CRWA is strongly opposed to. Just so you know, there was openness among many of the advocates in a way that I found very surprising and disappointing to the idea of the road in the river, and in fact, just filling in the river. And I can see why some people would think that that's okay, because for those who know the history of this area, the Charles River is significantly reshaped since what it was when Europeans first arrived. I mean, the dam that creates the lower basin and makes it fresh water, it's not tidal anymore. So much fill that's created the current contours of the city of Boston were man-made, and we don't dispute that. But that was then. We now do things differently, and there's a reason that there's so many laws against or making it very difficult to fill in a river, number one. So we don't think that just because we had sort of a very we had that mindset in the past that we should be doing that again. We think we should be preserving and restoring the river as much as we can, and focusing on the ecological health, not just what's convenient for our built environment. And also, in an era of climate change, bringing heavier rainstorms, which we are already seeing, it's not really what we want to be doing to narrow the river when we're going to need more flood storage, not less. I did have a slide in here earlier showing the map from Climate Ready Boston. This area is seeing increasing flooding already, and it's definitely going to more and more over the years. So that would be another reason that, if anything, as we build this project, we need to be building more flood storage into whatever gets built, not less. So this is just us at the MassDOT, you know, with our no road in the river signs. Next. And from CRWA's perspective, as I said, they did come out pretty strongly against any option that will cause an intrusion into the river. And especially because the area right now is, the riverbank is heavily degraded. There are outfalls that carry stormwater and stormwater pollution directly into the river, untreated right now. So this area is the source of a lot of pollution into the river right now, and that can be addressed with this project, and should be. So just to lay out what the issues are right now, there's three options that Secretary Pollack are considering, three options that she is considering. I-90 in Soldiers Field Road at grade, which is the rendering that Clint showed you. The issue there from CRWA's perspective is the way that MassDOT would do it, maintaining all 12 lanes, as you saw, had one lane of Soldiers Field Road in the river and the bike path in the river. So they would have to fill in the river. So she's not going to do that. We know she's not going to do that. That's what that letter from Secretary Thea Hardy's was about, saying you can't really do this. I-90, maintaining I-90 on a viaduct. That is very, very unpopular with a lot of folks, particularly those people who live in Allston, who, you know, the Mass Pike coming through really significantly changed their neighborhood, and not for the better. So this is an opportunity to make things better for them. Keeping the viaduct would not do that.
And Brookline.
And Brookline. And Soldiers Field Road on the viaduct, which is basically a modified version of the first design from last year, except it's even higher and sort of more intrusive. As far as they're saying, as far as what MassDOT is saying, they're still saying it would require a temporary road in the river. Now, the MAPC came out calling for, if you're going to do that, you know, just build it by shutting down Soldiers Field Road instead of putting a road into the river. MassDOT hasn't agreed to do that. So from CRWA's perspective, two of these options still entail fill in the river. The only one that doesn't is the viaduct. I personally don't support that. I think that we can do better, but it would require, if we're going to do the at-grade option, it has to be with fewer lanes, or at the very least, narrower lanes. Clint, do you want to add anything to that?
I forget how many more slides do we have left? Is this the?
I think we're almost done.
Yeah, so there have been, you know, various alternate versions of the at-grade option proposed. I mean, A Better City has one. People are, you know, People's Pike is advocating for narrowing the lanes but keeping them all. You know, it's not really going to increase the shoulders, and it's not really going to avoid the intrusion into the river. But so anyway, there are some variations on this. I do think that most of the advocates are coalescing around an at-grade solution, but there are some variations within that, which can be worked out, you know, during the design process. But I think the one lane of Soldiers Field Road in the river, is that only during construction, or is that permanently?
No, that would be permanent. I mean, you can kind of see it in your rendering. It would require, you know, sticking a road right next to the edge. So you're not going to be restoring the edge there. You're actually going to be having to.
Right. The road goes to the edge, and they may be filling in. I don't know. It's unclear what they're doing with the mixed-use path. But from that diagram that I showed, it looked like Soldiers Field wasn't in the river, but it came all the way up to the river.
Right.
So,
well,
I don't know.
But there is one more slide. I know there's one more.
Okay.
Which is where we talk more about the and so you haven't seen a lot of the advocates calling for reduced lanes. And when I've been raising this with some, basically they're like, well, yeah, that would be great, but Stephanie Pollock will never go for it, so we're not even going to ask for it. I don't think that's super effective advocacy, frankly, particularly when, and so here we get, this slide gets into a little bit of details. The Pike is already 3 lanes west of Newton Corner. Okay, so that's not a big change in, you know, for much of the Pike going west. Traveling east, and then in terms of the current, or I should pre-COVID traffic patterns, there wasn't a lot of traffic going westbound in that at any time in that area. The only time you could justifiably say you only need 4 lanes is going in either direction, is going east during the morning rush hour. So basically what that means is that, considering we're talking about, let's just say if in theory we could reduce Soldiers Field Road to 2 lanes and the Mass Pike to 6 lanes, you're spending an extra $300 million, because this is over $1 billion project, for those additional, you know, it's about 1,000 people for 90 minutes, Monday through Friday. In theory, one could do some other things to change behavior during that time so that you don't even require, then there would be no argument for needing the volume of the road capacity at that time. And remember, this was pre-COVID. We know now, there's I cited a recent Mass Inc. poll that 40% of workers who are able to do so said they'd prefer to continue to work from home. You don't hear anyone talking about, wow, it's a new reality. Maybe we'll never be back to the way we were. But even if we are, how could we work with our employers to incentivize people to come in at different times? How can we do bus only lanes? Can we do better transit? And I can speak as someone who lives in Newton. Going into Boston on the commuter rail is fine if you're going at the times that they already offer service, but you really can't mix it up much because it's pretty limited, the times that they go. And also keep in mind, MassDOT has already said there's going to be 6 lanes of traffic for years during construction. So what they're saying is that after commuters have been used to it for years, then we're going to go back and give them 8 lanes again. That makes no sense, particularly when you consider our wider climate goals that we're trying to get people out of their cars, trying to get people walking, biking, taking public transit. Why would we be maintaining our 1950s, 1960s model of 12 lanes of traffic when we have this opportunity to do things differently and save money? And in addition, I see you can't see the whole thing, but a letter signed by 45 Metro West legislators, and they're a very important voice in this, because if their constituents, you know, hear that, oh, lane reduction, that's only going to hurt me, then that will be very hard for them to be supportive of this. But they're already, this was the letter from about 6 months ago to Secretary Pollock and MassDOT. They're already calling for, I was going to read it, I can't see it all, but better parking at the commuter rail, free park and ride, I think buses, I can't remember what else. So we already have a constituency that's demanding alternatives to car traffic. So if we were to all join together and say, you know what, MassDOT, this is our opportunity to do the right thing, be bold, reduce the lanes here, invest in alternatives, which you need to do anyway, and then we can get park and bikes and pedestrians, and you don't have to have pedestrians, you know, fighting with, you can even have a separate lane for bike commuters so they can go super fast instead of, you know, the strollers and the pedestrians. We could get everything that we want, but not with those 3 models that we showed you earlier. Clint, do you have anything to add?
No, not really. I mean, it's kind of a strategy political question in terms of how to proceed here. There's so many stakeholders and so many competing requirements. It's been very challenging. I mean, this project's been going for 6 years or more, and I mean, to MassDOT's credit, it was originally, it's run out of the highway division, so it was originally seen as, oh, we're going to rebuild the viaduct, and then it has morphed into a true multimodal project, but not as far as it needs to go, as I think Emily and I have been hammering you with.